In the early spring of 1847, somewhere along the maze of tidal inlets between coastal Georgia and northern Florida, authorities pulled 17 bodies from the St. Mary's River. Within 6 weeks, that number reached 44. By the start of autumn, regional newspapers stopped printing accurate totals, referring only to continuing fatalities in vague columns. What they withheld from the public was the detail that every body carried identical markings, a precise configuration of wounds that pointed unmistakably to a single hand, a single method, a single executioner. Judicial archives in Jacksonville, forgotten in a courthouse basement for more than a century, reveal something far darker. Witnesses repeatedly spoke of a tall man who vanished after every incident, leaving behind no tracks, no weapon, no reason, only corpses. Confederate communications from 1863 mention him again, nearly 16 years later, still operating, still unapprehended. By the time Reconstruction ended in 1877, the unofficial death toll connected to this one individual had surpassed 200 white men. Plantation heirs, overseers, bounty riders, traders, and even one federal deputy. No arrest was ever recorded. No remains ever identified. And perhaps most unsettling of all, accounts from the era suggest that hundreds of enslaved people knew his identity, yet not one ever uttered his name to white authorities. Before we continue with the tale of the man they whispered about as the Marsh Phantom, I need you to do something. If this already sounds unbelievable to you, hit that subscribe button, because what follows will challenge everything you thought you understood about American history. And drop a comment telling me which state you're watching from right now. The truth is, this story doesn't begin with bloodshed. It begins with a transaction scribbled in fading ink across yellowing ledger paper, carefully stored in the archives of the Florida Heritage Foundation. On March 12, 1831, a slave auction unfolded in front of the courthouse in the port town of St. Augustine. The morning air hung thick with humidity, carrying the marshes' salt stench mixed with the sweat of terrified men and women lined up for sale. According to the ledger, a 24-year-old man identified only as Jonas Fielding, sound physique, no visible impairments, was sold for $775 to a rice grower named Silas Redford. Nothing about the purchase stood out. Jonas stood on the block beside 14 others brought down from a bankrupt tobacco operation in the Shenandoah foothills of Virginia. The auctioneer, a stout man named Hadley, who had been calling sale for nearly 2 decades, noted Jonas's unusual height, over 6 feet, rare for the era, and his muscular frame, clearly shaped by years of difficult field labor. He recorded that Jonas had strong teeth, that scars from older whippings crossed his back, though none appeared fresh, and that he moved with the rigid, conditioned compliance of a man long punished for resisting. What Hadley did not note, because he had no reason to even imagine it, was that Jonas could read not only basic English, but advanced texts. He also understood the coastal Creole dialect spoken by the Gullah people, and enough Seminole and Creek to converse with the indigenous families who still passed silently through the wetlands like remnants of a disappearing age. Jonas had learned these abilities through years of quiet observation, listening to conversations he was never meant to hear, studying maps when overseers grew careless, memorizing patrol paths of slave hunters, and tracking the timings and weaknesses of plantation routines. He had mastered the art of invisibility while perceiving everything. Silas Redford, his new owner, was a second-generation rice magnate whose wealth stemmed from thousands of acres carved out of stolen wetland. His estate, known as River Cross, covered nearly 3,800 acres of fertile, flood-fed soil along a sharp bend in the St. Mary's River. The plantation operated with 240 enslaved workers, making it one of the most extensive agricultural enterprises in the Florida-Georgia borderlands. By the standards of his class, Redford considered himself enlightened. He had attended the University of Virginia, traveled through Europe, collected books on irrigation, engineering, and classical philosophy, and enjoyed the reputation of a fair master. He claimed he never disciplined without reason, ensured his slaves had adequate rations and shelter, and permitted family units to remain intact, believing it reduced escape attempts and increased productivity. What Redford refused to understand, what none of them understood, was that oppression cannot be softened into kindness. You cannot chain a human being gently. And some men, when everything is taken from them, do not collapse. They sharpen. Rice cultivation in the southern wetlands demanded precision, endurance, and knowledge passed down over generations. Fields had to be meticulously flooded and drained in cycles aligned with lunar tides. A labyrinth of canals, dikes, levees, and sluice gates regulated water from a river. Enslaved laborers spent their days submerged waist-deep in murky, insect-ridden water beneath the punishing sun, planting, weeding, and harvesting grain while swarmed by mosquitoes that bred in the standing pools. The environment bred malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, and countless lesser-known fevers. Medical notes from the era indicate that nearly 40% of those enslaved at River Cross died before turning 30. The plantation consumed human lives like machinery devours fuel, purchasing new workers annually to replace those who died or collapsed beyond usefulness. Jonas arrived at River Cross in shackles on March 16, 1831, accompanied by 6 others from his Virginia estate. They were marched through the main gate, past a whitewashed manor house with its columned veranda, past the overseer's cottage and barns, down toward the slave quarters, a handful of rough wooden cabins arranged in rows behind the work sheds. Jonas was placed in the 3rd gang, the lowest level of field labor, reserved for newcomers and the punished. The gang was supervised by Nathaniel Broom, an overseer who had spent 8 years at River Cross and earned a reputation for merciless discipline. Broom kept a braided rawhide whip looped through his belt, and he used it freely on anyone who seemed sluggish or dared show the slightest hint of defiance. During the first several weeks, Jonas did exactly what was expected of him. He rose before dawn when the horns sounded. He swallowed his ration of corn mush and cured pork. He worked in the flooded rice fields from sunrise to sunset, planting seedlings in the waist-deep paddies, his spine aching, his palms split and raw. He spoke only when spoken to, kept his gaze low, and revealed nothing. To Broom and the other overseers, Jonas was just another laborer, a pair of hands indistinguishable from the dozens of others bent over in the heat. But Jonas was learning. Every single day he memorized more: the layout of the estate, the overseer's rotating patrol schedules, which canal gates were open when, which paths were traveled most often, how water coursed through the irrigation system, where the boundary fences stood, where the woods thickened, where the marsh swallowed footprints. He learned which overseers were lazy, which were cruel, which were predictable, and which were dangerously alert. He learned their habits, their weaknesses, their blind spots. He learned to slip through River Cross as though he were part of the landscape itself. And he waited. For 3 years and 4 months, Jonas disappeared into the machinery of plantation life. He blended into the background, unremarkable, unnoticed. New slaves arrived. Others died. Some were sold off. A few ran and were dragged back bruised and broken. But Jonas kept his head down and his mind sharp, biding his time like a predator lying low in tall grass. Then, on August 6, 1834, everything shifted. The first man to die was an overseer named Calvin Hargrove, and at first, his death appeared to be nothing more than a tragic incident. It happened during harvest, when the rice stood tall and every hand on the property was needed. Hargrove had been inspecting the lower paddies near the southeastern edge of River Cross, an area where canals ran deep and the mud-slick banks sloped sharply into the water. According to the statement filed with the county sheriff, Hargrove had been walking along a drainage embankment when he supposedly lost his footing in the wet clay. He slipped down the bank and struck his skull on one of the heavy wooden sluice boards used to regulate water levels. His body was discovered 2 hours later by an enslaved man named Abram, lying face down in less than a foot of stagnant water. His skull was cracked open, blood swirling into the brown canal. The plantation physician, Dr. Ellery Thorne, who visited River Cross twice weekly, examined the corpse and recorded it as an accidental drowning. Hargrove had slipped, hit his head, and fallen unconscious into the water. It was a believable conclusion. The canal banks were notoriously dangerous, treacherous even to experienced workers. Men had fallen before. Thorne wrote the details in his medical register, collected his payment, and rode away. Silas Redford was unsettled by Hargrove's death. He had employed the man for 5 years and considered him steady and loyal. Still, he accepted the doctor's ruling. Accidents were part of plantation life. Men fell from horses. They were crushed by timber. They drowned in the irrigation ditches. Death was simply considered an unavoidable cost of doing business. Redford ordered Jonas and 5 other men to dig a grave near the edge of property, in the small cemetery where enslaved laborers and overseers were buried in segregated rows. They lowered Hargrove into the earth on a humid August afternoon while flies buzzed thickly in the air. What Redford didn't know, what the physician failed to detect, was that Calvin Hargrove had not slipped. He'd been shoved. And the hands that shoved him, that held his face beneath the water until his thrashing stopped, belonged to Jonas. 6 weeks later, a second overseer vanished. And this time, there wasn't even a body. Reed Walters, only 27 years old, had been working at Rivercross for less than a year. He came from a small plantation near the Carolina Midlands and was still adjusting to the complexities of rice cultivation. On the evening of September 22nd, 1834, Walters left the overseer's cabin to make his nightly rounds through the quarters, a routine inspection to ensure all workers were accounted for before dusk fully surrendered to darkness. The sun had set, but the sky still held a pale orange glow. Walters carried a lantern and a pistol, standard equipment for evening patrols. He never returned. When he failed to appear for breakfast the next morning, the overseers formed a search party. They scoured the property, calling his name, probing the fields, the riverbanks, the wooded thickets. They searched the cabins, interrogating every enslaved person they encountered. They followed the usual patrol paths, dragged segments of the river, and sent riders along the roads leading away from the estate. 4 or 5 days they searched. They uncovered nothing. No footprints, no clothing scraps, no blood, no sign of a struggle, no clue of where Walters had gone. After a week, Redford declared him a deserter, though the story made little sense. Overseers did not abandon high wages, warm beds, and authority. They did not disappear without taking their belongings or their horse. Rumors spread among the white staff. Some claimed Walters had gambling debts in Jacksonville and fled. Others whispered he had gotten drunk, fallen into the marsh, and been taken by the current. A few suggested he might have angered the wrong slave, but without a body, there was no way to prove anything. The mystery went cold. Redford hired a replacement. Life at Rivercross carried on. But in the quarters, after dark, in low voices that carried no farther than a single cabin wall, people began to talk. Abram, the man who had found Hargrove's body, quietly told a few trusted companions he had seen Jonas near the lower canals at the same time Hargrove was doing his inspection. A woman named Rosa mentioned she'd seen Jonas returning to his cabin late one evening with soaked clothes and mud caked around his wrists, right around the time Walters disappeared. None of them reported these things. They never spoke of them openly. But a quiet understanding began to spread among the enslaved people at Rivercross. Something had shifted. Someone was fighting back. Then came the third death, and this time there were witnesses no one could dismiss. On November 21st, 1834, an overseer named Luther Maddock was supervising a work gang in one of the remote rice plots near the far southwestern edge of the Rivercross estate. It was late afternoon, sunlight slanting low through the moss-draped cypress trees that ringed the field. Maddock was a vicious man with a reputation for erupting into violence at the slightest provocation. He'd been at Rivercross for nearly 3 years and carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed cruelty proved authority. Enslaved workers dreaded being assigned to Maddock's gang, knowing that the smallest error, real or imagined, could earn them a lash across the face or back. According to the testimony later taken down by the district constable, Maddock had been standing near one of the main irrigation canals, barking orders at the spread-out field hands. A man named Cyrus was working about 30 yards away when he suddenly heard Maddox's voice spike in alarm, followed instantly by a violent splash. Cyrus looked up and saw Maddox flailing wildly in the canal. The overseer's arms heaved through the water as he sank, resurfaced briefly with a gasp, then disappeared again. Cyrus dropped his hoe and sprinted toward the canal, joined by 3 others who had heard the commotion. By the time they reached the bank, Maddox had vanished beneath the brown, swirling water. They scrambled into the canal, diving blindly into the mud-churned current. It took them nearly 20 minutes to locate Maddox's body wedged against the submerged support beam of a sluice gate. When they dragged him onto the bank, it was immediately obvious that something was terribly wrong. Maddox's throat bore deep, unmistakable bruises, marks left only by powerful hands squeezing with lethal force. His face was swollen and purple, his eyes bulging, his jaw slack. The men stood in stunned silence, water streaming off their clothing as they stared at what lay before them. The district constable, R.C. DeWitt, questioned every person who'd been in the field. He paced along the muddy canal bank, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events. But the more he studied the scene, the stranger the situation became. Every laborer had been visible to the others. The field was open, the water smooth, the terrain flat. No one had seen another figure approach Maddox. No one had seen a struggle. There had been only a shout, a splash, and then chaos. When DeWitt pressed Cyrus harder than the others, the man hesitated before offering a single, chilling statement. "Something came up out of the water," he said quietly. DeWitt demanded clarification. Cyrus only shook his head. His gaze went distant, as if replaying something he could not fully understand. "I don't know what it was." Mr. Maddox was standing there shouting. Then something just rose up from the canal. Too fast to see. And then he was gone. DeWitt wrote the words into his report, but he didn't know what to think. Something came up out of the water. What did that even mean? He questioned Cyrus repeatedly, but the man seemed genuinely shaken. No further details came. The other witnesses had nothing useful to add. They had been heads down at work, and by the time they looked up, it was already over. With no suspect, no weapon, and no clear description, DeWitt closed case. He recorded that Maddox had apparently been attacked and drowned by person or persons unknown. Silas Redford buried Maddox beside the earlier graves in the plantation cemetery and hired another overseer to replace him. But Cyrus's unsettling phrase, "Something came up out of water," lingered like a fever dream. It spread in whispers through the quarters. It grew in retellings. It captured something everyone sensed but could not explain. The killing seemed to erupt out of nothing. One moment life marched on as usual. The next moment a man was gone, wiped from existence by something no one ever saw. 3 deaths in 4 months was disturbing, but Redford still refused to see a pattern. He convinced himself it was a streak of horrific misfortune, the sort of unlucky chain that occasionally haunted large plantations. He increased patrols, instructed overseers to work in pairs when possible, and returned to business as usual. Then news drifted in from neighboring estates. An illusion of coincidence shattered. In December 1834, a slave hunter named William Darrow disappeared near the Milford estate, about 14 miles upriver from Rivercross. Darrow had been tracked and run away, and was last seen near the riverbank at dusk. His horse was discovered roaming the next morning, but Darrow himself never surfaced again. In January 1835, a traveling trader named Ambrose Talbot, who bought rice from plantations and transported it to Savannah, was found dead on a narrow dirt road between 2 estates. His throat had been cut with surgical precision, but his money pouch, containing nearly $280, was untouched. In early February, 2 overseers from different properties vanished within days of one another, both during nighttime rounds, both leaving not a trace behind. By March 1835, plantation owners across the coastal wetlands were gathering in shuttered parlors and dim offices to discuss what none dared voice openly. The deaths were too frequent to be random, too deliberate to be accidental, too uniform to be unrelated. Someone or something was hunting white men tied to the slave system, and whoever was responsible understood the land with uncanny expertise. They moved without sound. They struck with precision. They disappeared like mist into the marsh. That was when the name first took on form, not in newspapers or official registries, but in whispered conversations, in lamplit cabins, in the hidden corners of the rice fields. The Marsh spirit. It was never written in ink. No sheriff ever used it. But in the quarters, among the enslaved, who noticed things their captors never did, the name caught fire and spread. The Marsh spirit, a figure who flowed through wetlands like water, who killed without hesitation, who rose out of fog and vanished into reeds. Some said he could breathe underwater. Others insisted he could melt into the mist each dawn brought over the river. A few of the deeply superstitious claimed he wasn't human at all, but a phantom conjured by the suffering of generations. But the elders, those who had endured decades in bondage, knew the truth. They recognized the human mind at work. Someone with extraordinary discipline. Someone who understood the terrain like a native creature of the marsh. Someone who had learned to turn the very landscape that imprisoned them into a weapon. And some of them, when their eyes drifted toward Jonas, quiet Jonas, who rarely spoke unless spoken to, who moved with his head lowered, who seemed to dissolve into background, they wondered. The plantation masters reacted as men of their class always did. With more force, more restrictions, more watchfulness. They hired additional overseers and armed them with rifles and heavy-caliber pistols. They organized roaming patrols that swept the grounds at unpredictable intervals. They doubled the night guards. They hung lanterns along the outer fences. They tightened slave codes, limiting movement even further and imposing harsher punishments for even minor violations. Some estates required written passes just to move between work zones. Others raised their fences, locked quarters after dusk, and conducted surprise cabin inspections. None of it mattered. The deaths continued, slow, deliberate, perfectly timed. A hunter for hire in April was found with his neck snapped at the bottom of a ravine. A plantation steward in June turned up drowned in a creek barely 2 feet deep. In August, a county marshal investigating the killings was discovered dead inside his own jail cell, strangled with a length of cord that had somehow made its way into a locked room. Every victim was found near water. Every death suggested someone who knew the terrain intimately. Every killing demonstrated meticulous patience and a level of planning no white man believed a supposedly uneducated slave could possess. By the fall of 1835, Silas Redford was losing sleep. Rivercross had lost 3 overseers in barely over a year. Workers refused to go near the farthest fields at night. The remaining overseers were demanding higher wages to compensate for the danger. Some quit outright, unwilling to risk their lives no matter how large the pay. Redford had begun carrying a loaded pistol everywhere, even inside his own parlor. He could not shake the unsettling sense that someone was watching him, that something was moving across his property, studying him, waiting for the right moment. On October 16, 1835, Redford stood on the veranda of his plantation house, staring across the darkening fields stretching toward the river bend. The night air hung heavy with moisture, thick with the scent of mud, stagnant water, and rotting vegetation. Somewhere in the distance, a heron gave a sharp, metallic cry that sliced through stillness. He thought about Calvin Hargrove, pulled from the canal. He thought about Reed Walters, who had vanished without a trace. He thought about Luther Maddock, dragged under by something no one could name. He thought about the other deaths trickling in from neighboring estates, a pattern he could no longer dismiss. And then he thought about Jonas. Jonas, who never caused trouble. Jonas, who worked without complaint. Jonas, who had lived at Rivercross for more than 4 years and had never once been whipped or punished. Jonas, who knew every acre of the outer paddies because he'd been assigned to them since his arrival. Jonas, who had been present near all 3 locations where overseers had died. Jonas, whose cabin was always orderly, whose tools were always perfectly placed, who moved across the plantation as if he belonged to the land rather than being ruled by it. Redford had no proof. He had nothing except a tightening suspicion that gripped his chest every time he watched Jonas walk with that steady, intentional stride. Jonas never looked directly at him, never spoke unless answering a question, yet something about the man's bearing, a quiet, controlled confidence, made Redford profoundly uneasy. The next morning, Redford made up his mind. He summoned his estate manager and ordered Jonas sold. He gave no explanation. He simply wanted the man gone. Better to remove the threat. Better to send him elsewhere before something terrible happened. If he was wrong, he'd lose one reliable laborer. If he was right, and the cold certainty had assured him he was, then he might be saving his own life. On November 4th, 1835, Jonas was taken in iron restraints to the St. Augustine auction yard and sold for $760 to a cotton planter named Victor Hardell, owner of a sprawling estate in Pine County, 60 miles south. Jonas stood on the auction block without expression as Hadley, the same rotund auctioneer who had sold him 4 years prior, listed his attributes: strong, skilled, no health concerns. Hardell inspected Jonas's teeth, probed his arms, asked a few condescending questions in that patronizing way slaveholders use when speaking to property. Jonas answered softly, eyes lowered, the model of compliance. The sale concluded within minutes. Jonas was loaded into a wagon with 4 other purchases and sent south to Hardell's estate, a massive cotton operation known as Fairpoint, employing more than 300 enslaved workers. As the wagon rolled away from the city, Jonas glanced back once, then faced forward again, his expression unreadable. For 3 months after Jonas's departure, the deaths at River Cross ceased completely. No overseers died. No one disappeared. The plantation returned to its relentless rhythm of brutal labor, no longer shadowed by mysterious killings. Redford began to breathe easier. He convinced himself he had made the right decision. Whatever or whoever had been causing the trouble, he told himself, was gone. The Marsh spirit, if it had ever existed, had moved on. Then, on February 18, 1836, a slave hunter named Josiah Marin was found dead in a creek near Hardell's Fairpoint plantation. His body bore the same unmistakable signs as the victims along the St. Mary's: shallow water drowning, bruising from powerful hands forcing him under. The local constable who examined the remains noted in his ledger that there was something familiar about the manner of death, though he couldn't quite recall why. And in Pine County, the killings began anew. Over the next 14 years, Jonas was sold 9 additional times. Each sale followed the same pattern. A plantation owner developed a growing sense of unease, a creeping suspicion that something was wrong, that the sudden deaths occurring on or near their property might somehow be tied to this quiet, observant man who seemed to register everything. But none of them could ever prove anything. Jonas never broke rules, never contradicted an overseer, never showed open defiance, never gave. Of them, when their eyes drifted toward Jonas, quiet Jonas, who rarely spoke unless spoken to, who moved with his head lowered, who seemed to dissolve into background, they wondered. The plantation masters reacted as men of their class always did, with more force, more restrictions, more watchfulness. They hired additional overseers and armed them with rifles and heavy caliber pistols. They organized roaming patrols that swept the grounds at unpredictable intervals. They doubled the night guards. They hung lanterns along the outer fences. They tightened slave codes, limiting movement even further and imposing harsher punishments for even minor violations. Some estates required written passes just to move between work zones. Others raised their fences, locked quarters after dusk, and conducted surprise cabin inspections. None of it mattered. The deaths continued, slow, deliberate, perfectly timed. A hunter for hire in April was found with his neck snapped at the bottom of a ravine. A plantation steward in June turned up drowned in a creek barely 2 feet deep. In August, a county marshal investigating the killings was discovered dead inside his own jail cell, strangled with a length of cord that had somehow made its way into a locked room. Every victim was found near water. Every death suggested someone who knew the terrain intimately. Every killing demonstrated meticulous patience and a level of planning no white man believed a supposedly uneducated slave could possess. By the fall of 1835, Silas Redford was losing sleep. Rivercross had lost 3 overseers in barely over a year. Workers refused to go near the farthest fields at night. The remaining overseers were demanding higher wages to compensate for the danger. Some quit outright, unwilling to risk their lives no matter how large the pay. Redford had begun carrying a loaded pistol everywhere, even inside his own parlor. He could not shake the unsettling sense that someone was watching him, that something was moving across his property, studying him, waiting for the right moment. On October 16, 1835, Redford stood on the veranda of his plantation house, staring across the darkening fields stretching toward the river bend. The night air hung heavy with moisture, thick with the scent of mud, stagnant water, and rotting vegetation. Somewhere in the distance, a heron gave a sharp, metallic cry that sliced through stillness. He thought about Calvin Hargrove, pulled from the canal. He thought about Reed Walters, who had vanished without a trace. He thought about Luther Maddock, dragged under by something no one could name. He thought about the other deaths trickling in from neighboring estates, a pattern he could no longer dismiss. And then he thought about Jonas. Jonas, who never caused trouble. Jonas, who worked without complaint. Jonas, who had lived at Rivercross for more than 4 years and had never once been whipped or punished. Jonas, who knew every acre of the outer paddies because he'd been assigned to them since his arrival. Jonas, who had been present near all 3 locations where overseers had died. Jonas, whose cabin was always orderly, whose tools were always perfectly placed, who moved across the plantation as if he belonged to the land rather than being ruled by it. Redford had no proof. He had nothing except a tightening suspicion that gripped his chest every time he watched Jonas walk with that steady, intentional stride. Jonas never looked directly at him, never spoke unless answering a question, yet something about the man's bearing, a quiet, controlled confidence, made Redford profoundly uneasy. The next morning, Redford made up his mind. He summoned his estate manager and ordered Jonas sold. He gave no explanation. He simply wanted the man gone. Better to remove the threat. Better to send him elsewhere before something terrible happened. If he was wrong, he'd lose one reliable laborer. If he was right, and the cold certainty could assure him he was, then he might be saving his own life. On November 4th, 1835, Jonas was taken in iron restraints to the St. Augustine auction yard and sold for $760 to a cotton planter named Victor Hardell, owner of a sprawling estate in Pine County, 60 miles south. Jonas stood on the auction block without expression as Hadley, the same rotund auctioneer who had sold him 4 years prior, listed his attributes: strong, skilled, no health concerns. Hardell inspected Jonas's teeth, probed his arms, asked a few condescending questions in that patronizing way slaveholders use when speaking to property. Jonas answered softly, eyes lowered, the model of compliance. The sale concluded within minutes. Jonas was loaded into a wagon before other purchases and sent south to Hardell's estate, a massive cotton operation known as Fairpoint, employing more than 300 enslaved workers. As the wagon rolled away from the city, Jonas glanced back once, then faced forward again, his expression unreadable. For 3 months after Jonas's departure, the deaths at Rivercross ceased completely. No overseers died. No one disappeared. The plantation returned to its relentless rhythm of brutal labor, no longer shadowed by mysterious killings. Redford began to breathe easier. He convinced himself he had made the right decision. Whatever or whoever had been causing the trouble, he told himself, was gone. The Marsh spirit, if it had ever existed, had moved on. Then, on February 18, 1836, a slave hunter named Josiah Marin was found dead in a creek near Hardell's Fairpoint plantation. His body bore the same unmistakable signs as the victims along the St. Mary's: shallow water drowning, bruising from powerful hands forcing him under. The local constable who examined the remains noted in his ledger that there was something familiar about the manner of death, though he couldn't quite recall why. And in Pine County, the killings began anew. Over the next 14 years, Jonas was sold 9 additional times. Each sale followed the same pattern. A plantation owner developed a growing sense of unease, a creeping suspicion that something was wrong, that the sudden deaths occurring on or near their property might somehow be tied to this quiet, observant man who seemed to register everything. But none of them could ever prove anything. Jonas never broke rules, never contradicted an overseer, never showed open defiance, never gave findings to the federal district court in St. Augustine, along with formal petition for a warrant to arrest Jonas on suspicion of multiple homicides. The request was approved. Gresham assembled a detachment of armed officers, and on July 15, 1845, they rode to the Turpentine Works where Jonas was reportedly stationed. But when they searched the workers' cabins, Jonas was nowhere to be found. The camp overseer insisted Jonas had been seen that very morning, and several workers confirmed he had eaten breakfast with them, yet his cabin stood empty. His meager belongings, a blanket, a wooden bowl, a spare shirt, remained untouched, as if he had departed abruptly. Gresham questioned every worker, scoured the surrounding pines, followed every trail leading into the marshes, but Jonas had vanished as completely as if the land itself had swallowed him. Gresham refused to abandon the hunt. He launched the most extensive manhunt the region had ever seen, bringing in bloodhounds from Charleston, posting guards at every river crossing from the Ogeechee to the St. Mary's, distributing detailed descriptions of Jonas to lawmen, planters, patrol captains, and bounty riders across the coastal corridor. He offered a reward of $500, an enormous sum equal to a full year's wages for many men, for information leading to Jonas's capture. For weeks, he chased every whisper. Sightings in Florida, no. Alabama, no. Claims he had stolen a skiff and paddled north. Every lead dissolved into nothing. The marsh spirit had blended into terrain he understood better than any lawman, disappearing into the spine of the countryside where swamps, rivers, and forests intertwined. Then, on October 4th, 1845, Silas Gresham's body was found at the bottom of a steep ravine near the Altamaha timberline. His neck was broken. His rifle lay on fire beside him. His horse was discovered grazing calmly half a mile away. The sheriff declared it an accident. Gresham had been navigating dangerous ground near nightfall and likely slipped. But everyone connected to the investigation knew what had truly happened. The marsh spirit had struck again, eliminating the only man who had come close to unraveling his trail. After Gresham's death, the inquiry collapsed. No one else volunteered to continue it. Plantation owners stopped filing official reports, preferring to hire private security or stay silent. Newspapers ceased mentioning the unexplained deaths, whether to prevent panic or due to pressure from wealthy landowners desperate to avoid notoriety. The entire affair became a region-wide open secret, widely understood, publicly denied, and still the deaths mounted. Between 1846 and 1850, the estimated number surpassed 150. Slave hunters refused to work alone, traveling in tight groups for protection. Overseers carried multiple weapons at all times and avoided remote paths, especially near creeks or bogs. Some plantations hired armed patrol units, men who marched in rotating shifts across the land, but none of it mattered. The marsh spirit remained a step ahead, methodical, patient, attacking only when his targets were certain they were safe. In 1848, a particularly vicious overseer named Curtis Dahl met his end at a plantation near the coastal marshes outside Savannah. Dahl was infamous for his inventive cruelty, and his name carried a shiver across the slave quarters of multiple counties. He was found face down in a rice paddy barely 18 inches deep, the position of his body showing clearly that someone had held him under, kneeling on his spine until he stopped moving. Terrified, the plantation owner sold the entire estate within a month and moved his family to Charleston, abandoning the land entirely. In 1849, A wealthy trader from Charleston who had made his fortune in the slave markets visited a nearby estate to negotiate a purchase. The next morning, his corpse was found floating in a tidal channel with his throat cut so precisely that the examining physician noted it must have been performed by someone with medical knowledge or surgical precision. In 1850, 3 seasoned slave hunters, men who prided themselves on their expertise and traveled together for safety, disappeared in the swamp south of the Altamaha wetlands. They were last seen heading into the reeds, tracking what they claimed was a fresh trail. None returned. Search parties scoured the area and found nothing. Not their rifles, not their boots, not even scraps of clothing. It was as if the swamp itself had devoured them whole. The terror among white men tied to the slave system grew so severe that it disrupted daily operations across the coast. Overseers resigned in large numbers, unwilling to risk their lives for any salary. Slave hunters demanded enormous fees. Insurance companies refused policies for plantations in certain counties. Land values plummeted as buyers feared the region. A handful of owners even freed their enslaved laborers and fled north, unable to bear the psychological strain of knowing they might be the next target. But the most unnerving element wasn't the deaths. It was the silence. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of enslaved people across the Lowcountry must have known something. They must have heard whispers, seen signs, recognized a pattern. Yet not a single enslaved person, despite the lavish reward, despite the threats, despite interrogations so violent they bordered on torture, ever provided information leading to the Marsh spirit's capture. It was as though an entire oppressed population had collectively decided that whoever was doing this deserved protection more than any reward their oppressors could offer. Then, in early 1851, the pattern shifted. Jonas, if that was still the name he answered to, surfaced briefly in Florida. A plantation ledger from a property near Jacksonville records a purchase. Field hand, tall, mid-aged, answers to Jonas, purchased from Georgia state sale, $800. He remained there for less than a year. During that time, 4 men died. 2 overseers notorious for their savagery, a hunter who specialized in pursuing runaways through the Florida wetlands, and a local deputy known for crushing any sign of black resistance with theatrical brutality. All 4 deaths took place near water. All 4 were labeled accidents or unexplained occurrences. Then Jonas vanished once more. This time he remained untraceable for nearly 3 years. Some white landowners dared to hope he had finally perished somewhere in the vast, uncharted swamps of the Deep South. But within the enslaved communities, few believed he was gone. They whispered that he was merely resting, regrouping, waiting for the next moment the land called him back. When the pattern resumed in 1854, it was farther north, back in South Carolina, near Beaufort. A rice planter named Edwin Harlan penned a private letter to a colleague. "There's a man working my lower fields who unsettles me deeply. He is older than most of my laborers, yet he moves with a vigor that is disquieting. He speaks to no one, but he observes everything. I have sold men for far less cause than the unease he gives me, yet I cannot spare the manpower this season. I shall be relieved when harvest ends and I can send him away." 3 months after writing that letter, Harlan was discovered dead in one of his own flooded fields, drowned in water scarcely deep enough to cover a boot. The situation was impossible to rationalize. A healthy man in daylight drowning in ankle-deep water. The official report grasped for an explanation, eventually suggesting he had suffered a sudden fit or attack and fallen forward until he suffocated. But no one who read it believed such nonsense. Everyone understood what had happened, even if no one could speak it aloud. By 1860, the United States was ripping apart. The long-simmering conflict over slavery had reached its breaking point, with abolitionists and plantation interests locked in a political struggle that was dragging the nation toward civil war. Southern states threatened secession. Plantation owners fortified their lands, raised militias, and braced for battle. The seemingly indestructible institution of slavery was beginning to fissure. Yet even as the storm clouds gathered, even as the region braced for violence, the deaths continued, and if anything, increased. Overseers, patrol captains, ruthless planners, and men publicly condemned in abolitionist papers for their cruelty began dying at a pace that shook the Lowcountry. Some blamed rising tensions, claiming the violence was connected to the national crisis. But those who had been observing the pattern for decades knew better. The Marsh spirit was still at work, and he showed no sign of stopping. Then, on April 12, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and the South plunged into war. Everything changed at once. Plantations emptied as white men enlisted. Overseers became soldiers. Patrols dissolved as their members rode off to fight. The entire structure that had upheld the slave system collapsed under the weight of war. For 4 years, the South was consumed by the bloodiest conflict in American history, with over 500,000 men dying in combat from Virginia to Texas. Amid that chaos, separating the Marsh spirit's killings from ordinary battlefield, losses became nearly impossible. With death now everywhere, who could distinguish war casualties from something far older and quieter? The detailed records once kept, sale documents, death certificates, patrol logs, disappeared almost entirely. But Confederate military communications, preserved today in the National Archives, reveal a chilling detail. In 1863, a Confederate colonel named Marcellus Talbot wrote to a superior in Richmond describing what he termed a persistent disruption of supply lines in coastal Georgia. Talbot reported that over 6 months, more than 20 Confederate soldiers, sentries, scouts, couriers, had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The bodies were discovered in remote areas, invariably near water, often when the men were isolated. The troops claim a local Negro is responsible, Talbot wrote. They cannot identify him, but they have given him a name, the Marsh Spirit. The colored people will not speak of him, even under threat. Some of my men say he is a superstition, but I have seen the dead. Something is out there, and they insist he has been killing white men for 30 years. The effect on morale is severe. Several men refuse to stand picket duty near the rivers. They see movement in the water and believe death waits them there. Talbot requested permission to divert soldiers from combat to form a manhunt, but his request was denied. The Confederacy was losing ground. Union forces were carving their way through Georgia. Resources were non-existent. A handful of dead soldiers in the marshlands meant nothing when entire Confederate divisions were being destroyed at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. Talbot's plea was filed away and forgotten. And so, the Marsh spirit moved through a landscape reshaped by war, killing Confederate soldiers with the same cold precision he had once used on overseers and bounty men. By the time General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, and in the Civil War, the estimated number of deaths attributed to the Marsh spirit, if the scattered fragments of surviving evidence could be trusted, had surpassed 200 white men. And still he had never been captured, never positively identified, never left behind enough evidence for anyone to prove he existed beyond rumor and terrified whispers. After the war, during the Reconstruction years, the trail went completely silent. With emancipation, the entire infrastructure that had once tracked the movement, sale, and punishment of enslaved people collapsed overnight. There were no more plantation ledgers recording where Jonas had been sent, no more auction slips, no overseers writing reports, no patrol captains documenting suspicious deaths. The newly freed black population dispersed across the South, searching for lost family members, seeking work, trying to build fragile new lives in a devastated land where former captives and former masters were suddenly expected to coexist. And somewhere in that mass migration, Jonas, if he had survived the war at all, simply dissolved into history. The killings that traced his path through the coastal lowlands halted. Among white Southerners, the Marsh spirit faded into folklore, one more ghost story from a brutal era people preferred not to examine too closely. But within the Gullah communities of the coastal Carolinas and Georgia, descendants of the enslaved rice workers and turpentine cutters, the legend remained alive. It was whispered in Gullah dialect, told in low tones, passed down through generations in coded phrases outsiders never fully understood. And in those stories, The Marsh spirit was no demon. He was a warrior, a man who fought back when resistance meant certain death, a man who turned the landscape itself, the water, the mud, the reeds, the night, into weapons, a man who waged a private, relentless war against the institution that had tried to break him. There is one final tale, unverifiable but cherished, kept alive in a small Gullah community on St. Helena Island. Whether truth, embellishment, or pure myth, it offers a possible ending to the Marsh spirit story. And for that reason alone, it must be told. The tale goes like this. In the summer of 1877, 12 years after the war ended, an elderly man arrived on foot at a freedmen's settlement near Beaufort. He was tall but bent with age, his hair white, his face deeply carved with lines, his hands thick and twisted from a lifetime of hard labor. He carried himself with the stiffness of a man whose body had endured far more than it was ever meant to. He wore only the clothes on his back and carried a small bundle, a blanket, and a wooden bowl. The settlement was one of many that had risen during Reconstruction, communities built by formerly enslaved families on land they had worked for generations but never owned. This one held roughly 40 families, scraping by through farming and fishing, doing their best to survive in a world that still treated them as expendable. They greeted the old man with caution. After all, strangers could mean danger, as night riders and supremacist militias still terrorized black communities throughout the South. When asked his name, the old man simply replied, "Call me what you will. Names don't mean much now." He found an abandoned cabin on the edge of the settlement, a weather-beaten shack left empty when its last occupant died. He moved in without ceremony, and no one stopped him. Within a week, he had repaired the leaking roof, patched the walls, and made it habitable. He kept completely to himself. He never attended Sunday services in the communal church, never joined gatherings, never shared stories of where he'd been. He tended a small patch of vegetables behind his cabin, fished quietly in the creek, worked with his hands, and spoke only when necessary. The residents respected his solitude. Some of the younger folks found him unnerving. There was something in the way he moved, slow but coiled, something in his eyes that hinted at memories too heavy to speak aloud. Months passed. The old man became a fixture, present but separate. Then, on a warm evening late that summer, a group of younger men gathered around the central fire, reminiscing about the old days. One of them, a man in his 30s named Isaiah, began talking about the plantation where he'd grown up, a place ruled by a cruel overseer and an owner who pretended to be kinder than he was. I'll never forget his name. Isaiah said, Elias Claiborne. Owned near 200 of us. Claimed he treated us well, but his overseers were devils. 3 of them died while I was there. Claiborne never asked why, just hired new ones. From the shadows beyond the firelight, a calm voice replied, Claiborne drowned in '52, fell headfirst into one of his own rice canals. They said it was an accident. Muddy bank gave out beneath him. By the time they pulled him up, he was already gone. Buried him in the white folks section of the cemetery with a fine stone marker. The men turned. The old man had stepped into the flickering light, his lined face half lit by the flames. Isaiah stared at him. How you know that? That place was near Savannah. Were you there? The old man smiled, a small, distant curve of the lips, as if remembering something both dark and strangely satisfying. I was there, he said quietly, standing by the canal. In fact, you might say I helped him fall. Silence swallowed the gathering. Everyone understood what he meant, but no one dared speak. Isaiah began to ask more, but the old man had already turned away, walking into the darkness toward his cabin. No one followed. After that night, he never again mentioned his past. He lived another 6 years in settlement, quiet and unobtrusive, helping when needed, harming no one. The younger residents remained uneasy around him, but the elders, those who had endured the fields and the lash, who carried their own unspoken histories, treated him with something close to reverence. They understood who he might be, even if they never spoke his name, what he might have done, what role he might have played in that long shadow of history. In 1883, on a heavy July night thick with heat, the old man died quietly in his sleep. A neighbor found him in the morning after he failed to appear at his usual hour. There were no last words, no dramatic confessions, no final attempt to clarify the mysteries surrounding his life. His body simply surrendered after what must have been 75 or 80 years, most of them spent in chains. The settlement buried him in their modest cemetery, marking his grave with a plain wooden cross. No name carved into it, no dates. Dozens attended the funeral. Far more than one might expect for a man who lived such a private, silent existence. They sang hymns, prayed for peace, spoke about dignity and struggle, about the hope that someday their children and grandchildren might live without fear. After the crowd dispersed, 3 elderly women lingered beside the fresh mound of earth. They were among the oldest in the settlement, each past 70, each carrying the deep scars of enslavement. For a long time they said nothing. Then one of them, Esther, who'd been born on a rice plantation in coastal Georgia, whispered, "He was the marsh spirit, wasn't he?" The other 2 did not answer directly, but Dinah, tall and stooped, murmured, "Whoever he was, he did what he had to do. He lived long enough to make some of them pay for what they did to us. That's enough." The third woman, Rebecca, nodded. "Some stories," she said, "ain't meant to be told straight. Some stories need their shadows. Let the white folks wonder. Let them question it. Let them feel a little of what we live with. Fear of footsteps in the dark. Fear of punishment coming for them." The women stood in silence a while longer, then walked back toward their cabins, leaving the nameless man in his nameless grave, taking their knowledge with them to their own graves in the years that followed. The truth is, we may never know with certainty who Jonas truly was. We may never know whether the marsh spirit was one man or many, whether he was flesh and blood or a legend built from the fragments of whispered memories. The historical record is too fractured, warped by a society that treated human beings as property and did not deem their stories worth recording. We have sale receipts. We have death logs. We have court papers and newspaper clippings hinting at unexplained deaths. We have oral traditions passed down in Gullah communities. But we do not have proof. Some scholars argue that the marsh spirit was a collective invention, a story enslaved people told themselves to hold on to hope, to believe resistance was possible, to imagine themselves capable of striking back. They suggest that the deaths attributed to one figure were actually the actions of many individuals, scattered acts of rebellion later woven into a single mythic narrative. It's a compelling idea, honoring the many forms of resistance that have been lost to time, the quiet acts that never made it into official records. But others, historians who studied the timing, the geography, the consistency and method, argue there truly was a man sold in an auction yard in St. Augustine in 1831, a man who learned to use the swampy lowlands as weapons, who mastered the art of moving unseen, who learned precisely when to strike. So the deaths look like misfortune or fate. A man who waged a hidden war for 30 years, eliminating overseers, patrolmen, traders, and enforcers of the slave system, never seeking recognition, simply doing what he believed justice required. What cannot be denied is the death count. The records that survive point to more than 200 white men, overseers, bounty riders, landowners, deputies, who died under suspicious circumstances between roughly 1834 and 1865 in the coastal regions of Georgia and South Carolina. Many of the deaths share uncanny similarities. Bodies found beside water, no witnesses, injuries suggesting intimate knowledge of terrain, victims known for cruelty or violence toward enslaved people. And despite vast rewards, despite manhunts, despite relentless interrogations, no one was ever identified or charged. Most telling of all, enslaved people who must have known more than they ever admitted maintained complete, unwavering silence. Not one person, despite rewards or threats, ever offered information that led to the marsh spirit's capture. That silence is itself a historical fact, and it reveals exactly where their loyalties lay. The story of the marsh spirit, whether it belongs to one man named Jonas or many whose deeds merge together, reminds us that the official version of history is never the whole truth. There are buried stories, hidden archives, whispered accounts that do not fit neatly into textbooks. People were denied identity, denied the right to speak, denied even their own names, found ways to act, resist, survive. Some refuse to be broken. And it reminds us that when legal justice is impossible, when institutions protect the powerful instead of the oppressed, justice sometimes emerges in other forms. Forms that leave few records, forms wrapped in secrecy and fear, forms that make the comfortable uneasy. So tell me, what do you make of this story? Do you believe one man could evade capture for 30 years, killing more than 200 men without ever being identified? Or was the Marsh spirit something else entirely? A symbol, a collective force, a story carved from the pain and resilience of people who needed hope? Do you think Jonas died quietly in that freedmen's settlement in 1883? Or did he slip back into the marshes long before that, becoming part of the very landscape he once used as a weapon? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more untold histories, more hidden stories that reshape everything we think we know about America's past, subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves the mysteries history tried to forget. See you in the next one.